Right. Hello everyone. Welcome to the February edition of the Roundtable for Nickel and Dimed IR cluster and the economics cluster. So for this month, the two clusters will be collaborating. And the topic we are discussing is India's defense budget, since the union budget did come out last month. And our defense budget is obviously a very integral part of our government spending. And we will be comparing our defense budget with the defense budget of the country which is perhaps the greatest threat, or at least the most significant actor in India's security hemisphere right now, which is China. Um, right? So that is what the panelists from the Econ and IR cluster will be discussing today. So the first question that we would like to discuss is, in historically speaking, how has China's defense spending compared to India's, and what are the relative strengths of the two nations' militaries?
Yes, Hemant, you can go.
Okay, first of all, I would believe that both the Chinese and the Indian militaries are very capable militaries. They are not incompetent at their job. But the point is that both the Chinese and the Indian militaries know very little about each other. So the point here is, for China, I would say that the Chinese military has grown exponentially in the past few years, and it has a focus. The focus is on Taiwan. The focus is on USA. And now we have to look at the Chinese military in that way. Its task and purpose. Chinese military task and purpose is Taiwan, then breaking through Taiwan to the Pacific Ocean. And hence the majority of expenditure we see is on the Navy side, on the naval side of the military. We see new aircraft carriers, we see new technology, we see new jets. These are all as a part of focus against the Americans. Now, for the point with the Indian military is that the Indian military is also a good military, but its task and purpose is to defend India. It isn't made for high-speed operations outside the Indian border. And if you look at our focus was mostly on Pakistan and a little bit on China. For both India and China, the former was almost like they also exist. It was sort of they also exist in our universe. And all of our countries' focus was on internal securities. For example, the army was deployed in Northeast. The army was fighting the NAFA militants. In China, it was deployed to quell riots and protest. And also, PLA is a part of the Communist Party of China. They view it as their steel. They view it as a steel baton to quell the Chinese people in place. The Indian military is much more of a constitution body. It's a constitution organization, and as such, it's under civilian control. So it's a lot much more limited.
So I'm hearing what you're saying is basically differences between both the threats toward, essentially the threats towards which the armed forces of India and China were respectively oriented. Nakul and Tanish, if you guys would have something to add. First Nakul, then we can move on to Tanish.
Right. I'd just like to build upon that, and couple of just I want to talk about some things about China as well. Firstly, China is a much bigger country with a continental size and landmass, and it has border issues with several of our neighbors. Secondly, it has a GDP that is almost 5 times bigger than India. Also, it has been steadily growing, at least at an accelerated rate of development for last many decades. It also has an authoritarian regime with high-level militarization of the polity, which is the CPLA, the Chinese People's Liberation Army. It's also quite influential in making decision processes, and has literally been pampered since the late 90s through the double-digit defense expenditure growth. Also, China has a history of following strategic culture against its weaker neighbors, especially when we're talking about military. So its military modernization and the threat which emanates from therein is funded through their higher prioritization of defense, which is something that we also understand and focus on.
Right, Tanish, if you would have something to say, and then we can quickly move on to the next question.
Yeah, so China's budget for 2021 $6 billion in the same
And
year. So again, as they said, that the Chinese have a larger GDP, they have a better economy, so they can afford to spend more. But logistically, something I would like to add is that it's also easier for us to, because the thing is with our border with the Chinese, it's actually a large desert for the Chinese. So just logistically, it is easier for us to mobilize troops on our border with China than it is for the Chinese to mobilize troops on their border with us. And of course, they are also spending a lot more on their navy because their ambitions, geopolitical ambitions, are a lot different than us because they want to expand to the Pacific and have their own superpower ambition. Meanwhile, we are more of a defense force. So that's all.
One
Right.
thing
Right.
yeah,
Jatin,
one
go
thing
ahead.
that I would like to just add on to this would be that when you see the difference in the budget that China spends on their defense and India spends on their defense, one thing which is very clear is that China is trying really hard to modernize their defense. They spend a lot on modernization of their defense, whereas when it comes to India, DRDO, even in the latest budget, just got 5% of the whole budget. DRDO, which is the primarily center, concerned for innovating India's defense budget. There are different segments in which India has, started raising the funds when it comes to modernization of their equipments, modernization of their workforce. Now. So that is one stark difference that I found while also looking at the budget of two different nations.
Right. So the panelists have discussed quite extensively the Chinese armed forces, as Jatin rightly brought up, a heavy emphasis on modernization in recent times. Now, what would be the flip side for India, particularly in the 2023 Union budget specifically? What contributions has it made to security spending? What is the outlook after this year's budget?
So I'll just lay a foundation on it on certain terms. First of all, there has been a 13% hike in defense budget now. I think almost, I might be wrong, but there's a 5.94 lakh crore spending on defense budget this year, this tenure. And in that, I think 51% is again going to Army, 20% is going to Navy, and 24% is going to Air Force. And as I rightly said, 5% is going to DRDO. From the last time, if I see the increase, the one of the notable increase that India have done this time is in the innovation of defense excellence, that is IDEX, and defense testing infrastructure scheme, that is DRIS. They have been enhanced respectively by 93% and 95%. Like basically they were nothing before this year, and that is one thing that they have started looking for. Secondly, again, if you want to understand the difference between the percentage of revenue expenditure versus capital expenditure, 29% of the budget is going to capital expenditure of defense services and Ministry of Defense, Civil Services, and 71% is going into revenue expenditure. So that is something I would like to lay, and then we can continue with that.
Right, just to maybe add one specific point here. A certain allocation of the defense budget this year has actually gone towards infrastructure projects in critical border regions bordering China. We have the Sela Tunnel in Assam, with the Nichipu Tunnel in Arunachal Pradesh. One of our panelists, Tanish, did mention that mobilizing forces in these border regions is difficult, particularly for China, because of the barren nature of these lands. The same does apply for India to a large extent. So it's nice to see that the government has recognized that and is boosting infrastructure spending in that area. But I think a problem with the current defense spending, some might say, and this has historically dogged defense spending in India actually, so a very large portion of our budget goes towards paying salaries and pensions rather than actually spending on modern equipment. So even though our budget in absolute terms is pretty large, questions can raise about how efficiently we are spending that money. But
One of
as
the
Jatin,
Yeah, one of the other things that I also found was, even if there's a 13% hike in defense budget, we have overspended on budget from the last 5 years so much that even today, even with this hike, there is a deficit in the military budget right now, military spending right now. So there has been a lot of withdrawals in the past, but even with the increase in the defense budget right now, there are chances that it might get it to a break even, but there are chances that the military defense budget will still be in a deficit. So that is
right,
something that India can look at.
I believe the figure is something like $90 billion actually, which is quite a stupendous sum. But of course, one has to take into account, I think COVID particularly, it really affected government spending in a lot of sectors. Would be interesting to see how the government remedies that going forward. Moving on to the third question, I think our panelists have already talked about the perhaps the different security aspirations of India and China. China as a country which sometimes seems, which is actually definitely aspiring to be a superpower, almost hemispheric domination of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. India is more focused on its own defense. Now, a part of this is that India is forming certain security alliances, most notably the Quad, with Australia, USA, and Japan. So I would ask the panelists today, how do India's international security alignments and alliances such as the Quad, how do they affect its defense spending and its broader defense strategies? I can get started by saying that one issue which has perhaps developed in recent times concerning India and the Quad is that the USA, UK, and Australia have formed their own alliance independent of the Quad. They call it, well, very unimaginatively, they call it US, UK, OS. And unlike the Quad, this is a much more formalized defense structure, which, for example, I've seen the USA sharing some pretty covert military technology, such as nuclear submarine-related technology with Australia, which it has not done with Quad partners such as India and Japan. So it might be a concern that the USA is regarding the Quad as ineffective and is moving towards a different security alignment. Bhimant, I think, has something to say on this.
The major reason for this can be the fact that the United States of America is also currently is a focus for major restructure. Now it's shifting its focus from Europe to Asia. And when it came to Asia, it found out that not many of its states are interested in aligning with it. Because there's a famous phrase in Europe that if you are not in EU or NATO, Washington is far, but Moscow is near. Similarly, if you're not a member of the United States, in a way, Beijing is just right there. So the point was that many of these states have aligned themselves with China. So then you see India, Japan, Australia. Now these three nations are not those nations which have a shared ideas or shared ideas. The point here is that all these three nations have a joint problem with China. That is that if China gets more stronger, their regional security would be threatened. And that's the reason why US is using these three nations as a form of a wall, a form of bulwark against China. Now the major problem with that is both Japan, Australia, and India have three very distinct defense policies. Afghanistan, in Vietnam. But India, on the other hand, was far more neutral. It was, in fact, I could say it was against USA, American intervention in Vietnam and Afghanistan. While Japan didn't even had a proper armed forces right before now. The JSDF was much more focused on disaster relief rather than fighting an enemy. And I believe there's a famous quotation by, I believe, a general from Japan who said that if China was to land in Japan one day or the other, the JSDF can hold them for 3 days. After that, it's the traffic from Tokyo that's going to hold them. Otherwise, JSDF can't defend itself. And that can be said with the defense infrastructure of Japan too. It has a large economy, but does not maintain its military. And lastly, there's a fact that there's a large section of how do you call it, American phobia and Russian philia. That is, the Russians helped us in the 1971 war. They helped us by preventing the Seventh Fleet from sailing into Bay of Bengal and stopping the war. And there's a lot of American phobia that Americans are the new British. And the feeling is slowly going away, but it's still very present in the Indian strategic community. And the fact is that America is a bit less trusted in India than it is in anywhere in the world. Like, we have a strong relationship with Russia. It's very cultural, it's very financial, it's very defense, things in defense like tanks, military equipment. But I would maintain that the relations will take time to develop because India and America both differently focused on each other. America was focusing on winning the Cold War while we were focused on the interior.
Right, I
Yes,
think
sir. Go
Bhimant
ahead.
has quite effectively highlighted the historical differences between the security postures of India and USA, perhaps the other Quad nations as well. Tanish would have something to say here.
Yeah, I just want to add a small little point that with Quad specifically, I think one of the implications on the defense budget was could be that like we would see more money going towards the Navy and there would be more diversification that way because a majority of the defense budget right now still goes to the Army in specific. So
Makes sense.
One thing one thing which is also very clear is India is being very diplomatic when it comes to, how they are reacting to their defense strategies. One thing that is there, one thing that definitely their close attraction towards the Quad countries. Another is their, I would say, reliance, or I would say their, friendship with the AUKUS, that is the trilateral treaty between Australia, UK, and United States. And secondly, why still India is abstaining to vote against Russia, and the Russia-Ukrainian conflict is because Russia is a major arms supplier to India at this point. And we should look over how their reliance is affecting India in general. That's why India is being very diplomatic, according to me.
Right. As Jatin rightly mentioned, I think the Ukraine conflict is something which has really shaken up the international security framework, causing a lot of nations to kind of rethink their allegiances, or at least question if their current policies are in the right direction. Now, just building on that, Russia, I think, is well known as the largest arms supplier to India, which is also the largest exporter of arms in the world. I think despite a lot of initiatives towards promoting the indigenous arms industry, was still very much reliant on foreign, especially Russian arms. Now, in the light of the Ukraine conflict, Russia has been ostracized from Western financial and economic systems. There's a lot of questioning of Russian military strength, and in general, Russia is being stigmatized in international community. So, do you think that India should continue this very close security alliance with Russia? Perhaps we should reconfigure our alliances. Tanish, yeah, and Tanish then Dhiman.
So like if we look at 2005 to 10, I think 73.8% of all our military equipment imports were from Russia. But from 2015 to 20, it dropped down to 51%. So I think our government has already realized that we need to diversify who we get military equipment from. And I think it's very important, not only because Russia is being stigmatized right now in the world due to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, also because strategic autonomy is one of the most important core tenets of our foreign policy. And if, if situations like the Russia-Ukraine war interest and vote with regards to what is important to us. So it's important that we diversify who we get our military equipment from, which the government has already started on.
Adding to the
Right,
point,
Dhiman. Yeah,
adding to
Dhiman,
the
go
point,
ahead, please.
I would think the fact that we should now start building our own equipment. It's time has come for India to start building its certification. You're getting more and more stuff. And if you go to the army, you can't have an army which operates T-90s in one regiment, then the other regiment you have AML-90s, then another regiment you have M1 Abrams. That's why you are just screwing up your supplies. You are screwing up logistics. The fact is that India needs to start building its own stuff. Otherwise, what would happen that there would be verification and soon our military would be extremely confused. Whether this part will go in that way or that part. And that's it. One of the major reasons why defense budget is so much because we have a lot of equipment from many different countries. Look at our Air Force. We have Sukhois from Russia. 3 different countries, 3 different equipment demand, 3 different maintenance structures, 3 different timetables. Now suddenly you have to maintain 3 different platforms for doing your job. And that would increase your budget because you have to now spend more. You have to spend more on the equipment that you need. So I think that the key to reduce our defense spending and burden on Russia is that we start producing our own military equipment that would help us and be effective in the field of battle. Otherwise, I would strongly say that our dependence on Russia is not going out for a very long time because we need a long time because 51% is what we are now importing. There's already a stored equipment, the T-72s, the T-90s. They're already there in India, and India is the largest user of T-90 tanks. Not even Russia uses that much, and how much we use a T-90 tank. In fact, I could simply argue that in the 1980s and 90s, that India was a war. We weren't called Indian People's Army, and that might be an improvement, but we were all that in structure, in our formation of doctrine. On just 10 or 2 or 3 years, because we all seem to develop then doctrines for this new equipment that comes. Because equipment without doctrine is simply cannot do. You have to build up new doctrines, build up new training structures for the equipment that comes along. So I would think that our dependency on Russian equipment will stay out for long, but we should start building our own equipments now.
And I think one thing that I've observed also within the recent 5 years would be how India is subtly moving away when it comes to its reliance on Russian imports only. So when you talk about, having a strong relationship with Quad countries, having a strong relation with AUKUS countries, having a very good military trade relationship with Israel as a very good country with a very high-tech defense mindset, and having, get importing a lot of technology when it comes to, modernizing their defense also, which is again targeted to, disrupting the Chinese hegemony as it comes through. So that is also one way where India is trying to, diversify how they are approaching their imports when it comes to defense.
Right.
Yeah, with the point of Israel, I think I just want to add that I agree with Hemant here that logistically speaking, it's very difficult to get to obviously fund our indigenously developed equipment more.
Right. I think the panelists have raised certain very good points here that regardless of how much criticism Russia is currently facing in international arena, and despite the evident difficulty of maintaining relationships or any kind of strategic partnership with Russia, our dependence on Russian arms is something which will take us a long time to outgrow, but it is something we should aspire to for reasons of logistical clarity, if nothing else. I think we have had a very productive discussion here today. Unless any of the panelists has anything to add, I would be wrapping it up here. On the conclusion that while the 2023 defense budget has certainly um, diverted funds towards some key areas of our security structure, there's still a long way to go. India's defense budget at the end of the day is still only a quarter of China's. We are cognizant of the fact that China is a much more powerful economy, so they would be spending more than us. However, even within our limitations, we must aspire to be able to preserve our security. A big thank you to everyone who came here today, particularly Jatin and the guys from the Econ cluster. It was lovely to collaborate with you. So thank you on behalf of the IR cluster. And that's it for today. Good night, guys.